Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a spaniel ear in graphite. Now the very first thing I want to be doing is simplifying this as much as I can. Now my preferred way of doing this is to use graphite powder and an eye makeup applicator. In some situations I may use a paper blending stump, but if the fur has a natural softness to it, like this spaniel ear does, then I will usually opt for a sponge applicator like this. You can also use soft tools as well. Now with this graphite powder, my initial priority is simply just to map in the main lights and darks. This gives me a clear reference on where I am in my reference photo so that I'm less likely to get confused. Now with longer fur like this, the way that it is overlapping and curving can add additional complications to what we see in that reference photo and knowing what layer to draw first. Now if I do start to feel overwhelmed like that, I want to be breaking it up into small sections, but for fur that is longer like this, I do find working in larger areas easier. Now when I start working with my graphite pencils, I may in some situations really contain that to more of a 1 or 2 square inches potentially, but where I am trying to overlap or attach one section of fur to the other, it is much easier when avoiding harsh start and stop points if that area is larger initially. Now once I've got this softness in, and as you can see there are no harsh edges, I've made sure to blend where the darker values are into the highlight so there is a nice balance of midtones. Now the aim of a graphite powder layer is never to get it as dark as what the end result is going to be. That just isn't possible. So I want to be building up my layers gradually with the goal of then making my contrast and those darker shades really dark by my end layers. Now if I jump into my darkest, softest pencil such as a 9B at this early stage, I am going to end up with less depth and more graphite shine. Now graphite is a naturally shiny medium. There is no way of really eliminating it fully, but you can reduce the chances of that by making sure the layering process is correct. Now one of those ways, as I've said, is to build up those layers in many stages and not jumping into those soft dark pencils too soon. Now at this stage where I'm starting to use a HB or a 2B pencil, I want to be making sure that again I am reinforcing that softness and that I am following that fur direction. Now one of the more tempting things to do here, especially with spaniel ears where the fur is overlapping, is to try to draw the top layers of fur that we may notice initially at those more base foundation stages. Now if we do that, we're going to miss out on all of the depth underneath and the softness will be impacted. So what I want to be doing here is working with the fur that is initially closer to the skin and then building up these stages and finally completing with that final top layer where the fur is overlapping everything else. Now as I continue more of this layer, you can see that I am establishing more of those midtones. Now contrast is important, bright highlights, dark shadows, but the midtones help with the level of softness that is achieved. If the midtones here are missed out, then the fur is going to have a very rigid start and stop and that choppy look to the fur, which is going to make it look flatter. Now in all of my step-by-step tutorials, I always cover thoroughly the pencil technique. So how we need to hold the pencil, move the pencil, the pressure to apply and so on. All of this here is just as important as the layering process. Now because of that and what is involved when aiming for this level of realism, I like to record my voiceovers for my step-by-step tutorials while I'm drawing. So that enables me to explain everything in the moment. If there is a minor change to how I'm using the pencil, why I work with a specific layer and so on, I can mention all of that in the moment. Now this makes even the more complex subjects such as this easier to tackle, and it is something where I'm incredibly passionate about. There are no secrets. If I make a layer that I don't like, a mistake, I do a technique that I don't think then is as good, I want to try something else, I will always include that in my real-time tutorials because those are what make us better artists and help to improve our drawing skills. Now if you do have any art related questions, if there is something specific that you're struggling with, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments below and I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now at this stage of the layering process, you can see that I'm starting to build up more of my darker midtones. And with each layer that I'm adding here, I'm always refining the fur direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it does follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. However, when the fur is as long as this here, it's got more freedom of movement and has more of that flow. So it's really important to make sure that we've captured all of the curves and that there are no straight lines. We don't want any of those harsh edges. Now, depending on the size of the artwork, you may only be able to capture the main fur directional changes. You certainly don't want to be trying to force all of them. If you're working on a much larger scale, then you've got more room to do that. But certainly just capturing the main changes is what's going to help make that artwork look more realistic on a size portrait like this. Now this was only an 8 by 12 inch, so it's perfect for a little head and shoulder study as this, but I can really maximise the amount of detail to include when working larger. However, there is still a very high level of realism that can be achieved on these smaller drawings if the right techniques are used. Now at this stage, I'm really starting to refine more of my contrast. So at each point here, I want to try to simplify the layering process as much as I can. Now with each layer, I will usually start by hinting at the next darker shadow so that I know exactly where I am when I glance at my reference photo and back at my drawing. One of the challenges when working on complex fur textures like this is it's very easy to lose where we are. So if you look back at your reference photo and then back at your drawing, sometimes we might spend minutes trying to work out where we are. Now that can add a lot more confusion and stress to the drawing process. So if I can visualize exactly where I am, if it's a specific shape, maybe a curl that stands out more in the reference photo, I like to map that in so that I've got something there that I can refer to. Now the other thing that's important to remember here is the darker areas that I am mapping in is the similar process that I used with that very first layer of graphite powder. So with each stage here, I'm only looking at the one layer that I'm working on. I'm currently ignoring all of those lighter highlights on top. Now, one of the fears when working with graphite, especially when the layers are going to end up as dark as this, is that we may not be able to use the erasers to pull in those highlights over the top. Now, if the wrong pencil technique and the wrong layering process is used, those erasers can have a real difficulty in being able to lift that graphite. So this is another reason why I like to work in many layers. If I don't add excessive pressure to early layers, then the erasers are going to have a much easier time of lifting that graphite. Now, burnishing is a term that is referred to excessive pressure early on, which does flatten the tooth of the paper. Now, I personally like to use a smoother paper for my graphite drawings, but it still does have a little bit of tooth. Now, if I was to burnish and really press that pencil into the paper, I'm going to flatten that even further. It's going to then prevent me from adding additional layers on top, and those erasers are going to struggle to lift the graphite because it's really been jammed into that paper. So building up the layers in stages like this has so many additional benefits. Now, the other thing as well is I haven't as yet used an eraser up to this point. I'm still allowing the lighter layers of graphite to show through as my highlights. Now, I wouldn't want to leave the contrast as it is. The fact that I don't yet have brighter highlights in means that this fur at the moment, it looks a little bit flatter. So being able to pull in those highlights over the top is going to have a big impact, but we need to do it at the right time. If those highlights are added too soon and we don't have the darker layers underneath, then the highlights aren't going to have the same impact either. Now, an example of this is, let's say we've got the white of the paper showing through for a really bright highlight, such as the reflection in the eye. If I want that to look brighter, but I know that I physically can't because it is the white of the paper, then that is an indication that what's next to it isn't dark enough. If I darken up those values, it will immediately make that highlight appear lighter. Now the same goes with a darker layer. So let's say I've used all of my graphite techniques, I've got that as dark as I can get it, but I do want to enhance the look of that contrast further. That then means that I can try to lighten up what's next to it, next to that dark shadow, and that will help to make that appear darker. So all of these alterations in that layering process is important, but it does need to be done at the right stage. So here I'm using my Tombow mono eraser, and there are some sections that are removing the graphite easier and therefore they look lighter than others. Now this actually adds a huge amount of extra depth to the drawing without any real additional work. You don't want all of your highlights to be the same brightness. So the fact that in some areas that eraser can only remove a certain amount is going to give you the equivalent of a darker midtone rather than a bright highlight. Now the other thing as well is no matter what highlight I've added, whether or not it's with this Tombow mono eraser or a battery eraser, I always usually then darken those highlights to some degree. Now like here I'm coming back in with a graphite pencil, but it might be as simple as using a paintbrush like there, I've just used that to get a very thin layer of that graphite back over my highlights. So when I then come back in with the erasers, I can then add in more highlights, but it's just softened the highlight underneath. This really is another technique that works well for adding in additional softness and depth to any fur that we're drawing. It doesn't matter if it's a spaniel ear or the short fur on the face. These techniques and adjusting that layering process is what helps to take the art to the next level. Now this eraser is my battery eraser, and this takes a little bit more control because it is a much heavier eraser to have hold of. So that additional weight, it does take practice, and one thing that I always recommend to do is get a scrap bit of the paper that you're working on, apply some graphite powder so you've got something there as a layer, and then you can practice with your battery eraser just to create some fine lines and get the feel for how that battery is in your hand when trying to create these longer lines. Now towards these last stages where I'm starting to add in those little bits of hair on the very edge that overlap the background, having the variation in the highlights here so they're not all the same has added so much additional realism. Now the reason that that has happened is because of how I've built up my layering process. Making sure that I haven't just blocked in lots of dark, heavy pressure with the pencils and I've allowed more of those lighter layers to show through is giving me more of that natural variety when I put in those highlights. Everything here right from the base layer is still showing through to some degree. It's never about trying to cover up completely the layer underneath. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this Spaniel tutorial, then that is all live and linked in the description below. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments and I'm more than happy to help if I can. I am going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.